Over the next few days, Zoe's condition had improved steadily, and her unborn babies had once again begun to kick and move around inside her. Oliver received an update report from his man on the ground and frowned. There was still no news. Hope for the survival of his unborn children was fading, but he was unable to accept such an outcome. He sat down at his desk and put his head in his hands, just as an excruciating pain ravaged the depths of his skull. He grimaced and held his head until it passed. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and the color drained from his face. He rubbed his temples, and his whole body shook from the effects of the pain. Just then, the office door opened, and Stewart entered. He saw his boss's face and looked worried. "Sir, are you feeling unwell? I called you a few times just now, but you didn't hear me." Oliver slowly raised his eyes to look at Stewart. "I'm okay. What is it?" "This was sent over by the finance department earlier. It needs your signature and approval." Stewart handed him a document, and his gaze fell on the fine beads of sweat on Oliver's brow. "Did you have another headache?" "Yes. It was quite painful, but it's gone now." "Shall I make an appointment for you to go to the hospital for a checkup?" The concern showed on Stewart's face. "It might be more than just a simple headache. It's best to get it checked out." Oliver considered his suggestion for a moment. "All right, arrange it for tomorrow. I'll go to my private hospital." "Sure." Stewart nodded and left the office. Then, he called Oliver's private hospital and made an appointment for the following day. Oliver was a little concerned when he arrived at the hospital, but he tried not to think too much about what might be wrong with him. The doctor took him for a CT scan to see if there was anything on his brain. After the examination, he studied the report and hesitated, as if he was formulating the right words to say to his patient. "Mr. Williams, I think you should have an MRI scan. The CT results are somewhat inconclusive. The MRI is more comprehensive." Oliver looked at the doctor suspiciously. "What do you mean by inconclusive? What exactly is wrong?" The doctor cautiously placed the report in front of him and pointed to a dark mass on the image of his brain. "I'm afraid you have a tumor in your brain. We need to analyze it further to find out more." Oliver's heart leapt into his mouth, and he felt nauseous. He took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "Is it malignant?" "At this stage, it's impossible to tell. That's why I need to carry out a further examination. I'm afraid you'll need to undergo a few more tests before we can be sure what it is." Oliver clenched his fists in his lap and felt his heart pounding in his chest. "Okay, do it as soon as possible." Several hours later, after various scans and tests, the doctor finally reached a conclusion. "Mr. Williams, the good news is that the tumor in your brain is benign." The tension in Oliver's face eased, but his relief was short-lived. "However, the tumor's on the large side. If we allow it to grow, it may put too much pressure on the optical nerves, which could cause you to lose your sight. The other option, of course, is surgery. But there's a certain degree of danger in that, as I'm sure you can imagine. I'm afraid I can't guarantee that we can successfully remove the tumor." Oliver tensed up again and stared into the distance as he absorbed the doctor's words. "So the recommended course of action is to use a conservative radiation treatment method." "Radiation treatment?" Oliver asked. "Isn't that usually used for cancer?" "Radiation treatment is effective on smaller cancerous and benign tumors. As your tumor is relatively big, it will take longer to reach the desired effect." The doctor paused and took a deep breath. "It's currently the safest and most effective way to treat your condition." Oliver nodded slowly, but he said nothing. He looked along the brightly lit hospital corridor and was reminded of his brother Dan. I wonder how he felt when he was faced with a similar choice, he thought. Dan had tragically lost his sight during surgery and had been given the option of remaining blind or undergoing further surgery to restore his sight. The risk had been great, and the chance of success low, but Dan had opted for the surgery. He had died on the operating table. Oliver was being offered a similar choice: surgery that could kill him or let himself go blind. Both paths were less than appealing, and he wondered how he could possibly make a decision. As he thought about his fate, he recalled the story of when the Williams family had taken revenge on the Jungs, the medical family who had once served royalty. Some members of the Jung family had fled to Houston and changed their names. But Oliver's father, Arthur, had tracked them down and killed them all. Oliver was just a child at the time and had no idea what his father had done. Years later, his father took him back into his family. He wondered if the dreadful choice he was faced with was somehow payback for what Arthur had done. He felt like he was suffering because of the choices his father had made. His family had been destroyed by the Johnson family, and although he hadn't participated in its destruction directly, he hadn't done anything to prevent it. For that, he hated himself. But he hated his family's wrath more. He had been bearing the weight of hatred on his back and battling on for years, and he was tired of it. He thought that perhaps karma had finally come to him. Edward Johnson had been killed by his father's scheme, and Edward's friends had died in an accident in Mexico. Fate had given the Williams family 2 chances, and they had destroyed them both with their own hands. Dan was dead, and Oliver was facing a cruel choice. But he couldn't make the same choice his brother had made. He was the head of the Williams family. Many years ago, he had abandoned everything in Houston, given up his love, and chosen to shoulder the responsibility of the entire family. He saw no way out, and for that reason, he couldn't risk dying. The craniotomy was a dangerous operation, and with such a high chance of death, it was an option he couldn't afford to take, which meant he would likely lose his sight. He would have to get used to that idea, and accept that he might never again see the rising sun. But his decision was made. "I won't choose the surgery," he told the doctor. "I'll treat it with the radiation." The doctor nodded, but then he seemed to hesitate, as if he had just thought of something. Actually, there might be another way. Oliver's interest was piqued. "What other way?" "I can't be sure, but I've heard of something that's only a rumor." He paused to gauge Oliver's reaction. When he looked up at him with interest, he went on. "My ancestors practiced herbal medicine. My grandfather told me that many years ago, there was a brilliant practitioner from the Jung family who cured a patient with intracranial growth. Apparently, the patient was a descendant of the royal family." Oliver listened with some skepticism. So far, the doctor's potential alternative treatment option wasn't sounding too hopeful, but he was prepared to hear him out. "When the patient was 20, the doctor continued, he often had headaches and vomited a lot. The royal family's private physician was helpless. In the end, a man from the Jung family diagnosed the patient with a brain tumor. He told him that as long as he took the prescribed medicine, he would be fine within a year." He looked at Oliver and read the doubt in his face. The medication worked. A year later, he was fine. He never had another headache or vomited again. Oliver almost switched off when he heard the words Jung family, but he was prepared to give the doctor the benefit of the doubt. "But the Jung family was destroyed by my family a long time ago," he mused. "The only known survivor is Jacob Johnson." 2 days earlier, Oliver had found out that Jacob had gone to reclaim his position at the Franklin Group. He had also discovered that Jonathan was backing him. He suspected that Jonathan believed that the Williams family would never try to kill Jacob, and that was why he had let him join the company and face everyone alone. Oliver was aware that Jacob knew nothing about medicine. Even Edward, who had been a talented neurosurgeon, had known nothing about herbal medicine. Those ancient and mysterious medicinal formulae of the fabled Jung family were long forgotten and had turned to dust with the passing of their ancestors. "If we could find the Jung's prescription from back then and use pathology and pharmacology to analyze it, I believe it'll produce twice the result with half the effort of the radiation," the doctor said excitedly. "Radiation treatment is slow, and there's a limit to its success. You have to be mentally prepared." Oliver nodded. "All right, I understand. It's worth a shot." As he made his way to the elevator, he felt numb. He passed a hospital porter who was mopping the floor with disinfectant. The smell was so overpowering that Oliver thought he might vomit, and it made him realize that there had been several incidents recently when he had felt nauseous. He had put it down to stress, but it must have been because of the tumor growing in his brain. He held his breath until he got away from the smell of disinfectant and into the outdoors, where he could breathe fresh air again. He found his car and got inside. Normally, he would have gone back to work, but he went home instead. It had been unusually cold, and as he drove home, raindrops started to fall. When he arrived home, he parked his car and stood under the apple tree to enjoy the unseasonable weather. The tree's blossoms had long since bloomed and withered, and its bare branches reached into the sky like the arms of an old man. The rain intensified, and puddles began to form on the ground around him. Oliver sucked in the cold air, and for a moment, it made his heavy brain feel much lighter. He had no idea how long he'd been standing under the tree before he noticed that he was ankle-deep in water. Just then, he felt a flow of hot liquid coming from his nose. He touched the end of it, and his fingertips came away covered in blood. It dripped onto the ground and dispersed into a puddle. He tipped his head back to stem the flow. One of his maids happened to be passing by, and she saw him standing under the apple tree with his nose in the air. "Oh, Mr. Williams, you have a nosebleed. Let me get you a towel." She ran back into the house, and Oliver looked up at the sky. He watched the swirling raindrops. He felt the large drops of water land on his face and trickle off the end of his chin. At that moment, he felt a kind of exhaustion that went deep into his bone marrow. Since he was 18, he had battled through life. What was it all for? He wondered sadly. His father had passed away. His younger brother had died on the operating table, and the girl he loved was married to another man. Everything that had ever meant anything to him was gone, and it seemed that even his own body was giving up on him. I wish this tumor was malignant, he thought bitterly. At least then I wouldn't be faced with any stupid choice. I could just let it take my life, and I'd finally be free. Until that fragile moment, he hadn't known how close to the edge he was. The maid returned, and he leaned against the trunk of the tree and placed a towel over his nose. Soon, the bleeding stopped, and he straightened his head up. The maid had also brought an umbrella and a warm coat out for him, and she draped the coat over his shoulders. The warmth gradually seeped through his skin and into his bones, and he began to feel human again. He remembered Zoe and the babies, and he knew it wasn't yet his time to die. He still had no idea what happened to Zoe and his unborn children. Their lives, too, hung in the balance. There was still so much to do. Even if he went blind, he had to hold on until the day the children could inherit the family fortune. Oliver turned around and went into the house. Once inside, he made a call. Thousands of miles away, in Houston, Patrick Shaw's phone rang. Patrick was the doctor who had treated Oliver's burns. He had never been told of his patient's identity, so the name that appeared on his screen was a code name. "Hello, sir," he said into the phone. "Dr. Shaw, I want to ask you something," Oliver said, and he told Patrick that he needed to get his hands on an ancient Jung prescription. The doctor sighed. Sir, there's something you must understand. Putting aside the very real fact that there is no known descendants of the Jung family, no one truly knows if the prescriptions actually exist. It just might be a rumor." He paused momentarily. "But if you like, I can put in a request to the next pharmaceutical auction, which will be taking place soon." "Thank you, Dr. Shaw. I would appreciate that." "Actually, I just remembered something. Do you remember my friend, Dr. Knightley? She was the one who played the piano the day your treatment started. I heard that she inadvertently might have obtained a few Jung prescriptions. If you're in a hurry, perhaps you could ask her about it." "You mean Helga Knightley?" "Yes, that's her." "Thank you, Dr. Shaw. I'll get in touch with her." Oliver hung up the phone and considered what Patrick had just told him. Then, he sent a text to Esther. "Hey, Esther, do you have Helga's contact details?" Esther's reply came instantly. "Sure. Are you after some of her healing? What's wrong with you? Nothing. I just want to ask her about her prescription. Okay, give me a sec. I'll send her your number. Oliver waited, and Helga's contact details soon appeared on his phone. He looked at the profile picture, which contained two silhouettes leaning against each other, back to back. Instead of sending Helga a text, he sent her a social media friend request so that she could see who he was. They had met a couple of times. Other than the occasion that Patrick had described, they had also met at Esther's wedding. But they had never struck up any kind of conversation, and they barely knew each other. Oliver waited impatiently for some kind of response, and finally, that evening, he received a notification that she had accepted his request. He typed her a message, getting straight to the point. Hey, Helga. I want to ask you if you know where I can get a hold of some of the Jung family prescriptions. Helga read the message and felt wary. A lot of the Jung prescriptions were like gold dust. There were lots of people who coveted them, but very few were ever successful in obtaining them. She didn't know Oliver very well, and she knew that Steve didn't think much of him, so she couldn't help but feel a little cautious. She considered how to word her reply, and then she typed it into her phone. Hey, Oliver. I was taught everything I know by Sam Doyle. I have no idea how to get any of the Jung family prescriptions, but I'd be happy to give you some of my own suggestions if there's something you need help with. Oliver wasn't surprised at her cagey response. He half expected it, but it annoyed him nonetheless. Even if she knows how to get it, she's not going to tell me, he thought. He decided to tell her what was wrong in the hope that it might trigger a more sympathetic response. I have a friend who has a brain tumor. He then sent her all his test results, making sure his name and other personal information were removed. Helga carefully studied the report that Oliver had sent her. She was quite familiar with scientific medicine, and she could see that, although the tumor was benign, its size and location meant that they would have to find an alternative way to get rid of it as soon as possible. There were so many neurons in the brain that the risk of causing permanent damage, or even death, was too great. Her logical mind told her that the safest way to deal with the tumor was to attempt to reduce its size. She had heard the rumors about the way the Jung family had treated brain tumors from her tutor, but she had never been sure that any of their prescriptions really existed. Until a year ago, when Jonathan had given her some of them and made her sign a contract to keep it secret. How can I break the contract without breaking Jonathan's trust in me? She wondered. And how would that affect my relationship with Steve? So it seemed to Helga that she would have to tell Oliver that she was unable to help him. She messaged him her suggestion, which was that his friend should use radiation therapy to try to shrink the tumor. She added that she would keep an eye out for information regarding the Jung prescription and that she wished him luck. She hoped that would be the last she would hear of it. After closing off the conversation with Oliver, she checked the date and found that there was another matter that she had to deal with. So the following morning, she called Latham. Latham listened carefully to Helga's update and sighed. Thank you, Helga. It seems that ingredient truly is elusive. Oh well, I guess we can't expect any more miracles, so we'll just have to keep going with the current medication. He had initially been told that it would take 10 years for his leg to fully heal, but Helga had already reduced that time by half. He felt that he couldn't keep pushing his luck. 5 years was a long time, but it was a lot less than 10 years, so he resolved to persist and make it through as well as he could manage. They ended the conversation, and then Helga went to work making her medicine. She would make 2 forms of medication from the herbs she had gathered. Some of them were to be formed into a pill to be taken orally, and the others were to be made into a paste for external use. Together, they would help Latham's blood to absorb the medicinal properties into his bones. For the treatment to be effective, the medicine had to be used once a day for 6 months. After that, she would have to rely on Latham's body having enough of the healing properties in his system to manage its own self-repair. She had spent the last few days at home concocting medicine, and every day when Steve got home from work, he would find her busy in her medical room. He recalled the first time he had seen her making medicine. Her body had been covered in powder and liquid, and she had looked filthy. He had been repulsed by the sight of her and had left her to her work. If someone had told him that he would end up falling in love with her, he would have scoffed at the joke. But things had changed, and he had started seeing her in a different way. So when he came home on that particular day and saw her covered in dirt and busy making medication, he smiled affectionately and thought how endearing she looked. Without her knowledge, he watched from afar as she worked and noticed how focused and serious she was. She raised her head and looked at him, but it was as if she hadn't seen him, and she simply carried on as if he wasn't there. He gazed at her, and the light in the room encased her face like a halo. He knew that medicine meant a lot to her, and she was eager to pass her knowledge down to the next generation. He wondered how soon that opportunity might become available. Nancy had told them that if one of her babies ever showed an interest in medicine, she would be happy for them to learn from Helga. But Steve thought that Helga might like to have her own children one day to pass her skills on to. The thought of Helga with a child of her own filled him with a warm feeling. He walked up to her as she worked. "What are your plans for the future, Helga?" She stopped what she was doing and turned her face toward him with a look of puzzlement. "What do you mean by that?" There was a strange look on Steve's face that she couldn't read, but his eyes were warm and gentle. "You know, everything. Life, career, love." She stared into his eyes, wondering what was on his mind. But she thought seriously about his question. She couldn't think of anything special in her life. In terms of her career, she needed to find a successor, and she did feel that would be better if she could have a child of her own to take over for her. But she couldn't bring herself to say that out loud to her boyfriend without seeming presumptuous. As for love, she felt that she knew where that was going. But again, she couldn't say it out loud. Then, a thought occurred to her, and her heart began to pound in her chest. Is he trying to get me to take the initiative to raise the subject of marriage? I can't do that. So instead, she looked intently into his face. Apart from helping to treat Latham's leg injury, I have no other plans. The anniversary of my mentor's death is the first day of next month, so I'd like to go visit his grave. But other than that, I'm happy for you to arrange things. She smiled sweetly at him. Go ahead and arrange whatever you want. Steve frowned. That was a pretty flippant response. Is she saying that marriage isn't on her agenda? Maybe she wants to speak to her mentor, in the hope that his spirit will give her some guidance. He wasn't sure if she was playing him or if she genuinely didn't understand what he was getting at. Either way, he smiled at her. Give me your hand. Uncertain of his motive, she tentatively held out her right hand. Not that one. And he grabbed her left hand instead. He took a piece of cotton thread out of his pocket and wrapped it around her ring finger. Then, he tied a knot at the end, pulled it off her finger, and put it back in his pocket. Helga looked at him questioningly. Are you done? Yep, all done. He grinned, and there was a twinkle in his eye. Then, he changed the subject so that she couldn't ask any more questions. The chef made some of your favorites for dinner. Let's go and eat. Helga finished her work quickly and followed him into the main house. The next morning, Steve took his little piece of thread to the jewelry store opposite the company offices. He had made an appointment with the head designer, and he handed her the cotton thread. I'd like to go ahead with the design we agreed. This is her ring size. The designer took the ring of thread and smiled with satisfaction. That's wonderful, Mr. Davis. All our rings are handmade here on the premises. You'll be able to pick up the engagement ring in a month's time. Latham took one of Helga's pills and sighed with regret. 5 years is such a long time. How am I going to cope? Every day at noon, he had to drive to the Davis mansion to receive additional treatment from Helga. He went for the first time that day, and Ashley accompanied him. Latham wasn't sure if it was just his imagination, but he felt as if the pain in his ankle had already been alleviated after the first session with Helga. After the treatment, he had to rest for half an hour before he could leave. So while he rested, Ashley chatted with Helga. So now I have to grind up the herbs into a powder so that I can turn them into pills for Latham to take, Helga explained. Ashley watched as Helga took her mortar and pestle and began to grind the herbs. But after a moment, a strong smell emitted from the resulting powder, and her stomach churned. Helga noticed the color drain from her face. "Are you feeling okay, Ashley? Do you want me to check your vitals?" "Sure." Ashley felt queasy, and she allowed Helga to examine her. Once Helga was done, a strange look appeared on her face, which Ashley couldn't read. "What? Why are you looking at me like that?" Helga grinned. "You're 1 month pregnant." Ashley was stunned, and she turned to Latham, who sat there with his jaw hanging. The first thing that went through his mind was that they had been taking precautions, so he couldn't understand how it had happened. But then he remembered 1 or 2 occasions when they had gotten carried away and hadn't bothered. He and Ashley hadn't discussed the prospect of having a baby yet. They hadn't been married long, and Ashley was still young. There was plenty of time. They had both assumed that they would enjoy married life for a while before they committed to parenthood. But hearing Helga say that Ashley was pregnant filled him with a mix of joy and concern. "Are you sure, Helga? I mean, do you think the baby's okay?" He couldn't help thinking about the previous night. If he had known she was pregnant, he probably wouldn't have made love to her. "Does it hurt the baby?" he wondered. Helga read his face and understood what was going through his mind. She smiled. "I'm sure it's absolutely fine, but I suggest you both go to the hospital just to confirm the pregnancy and make sure everything's okay. That's the only way to be truly at ease." Latham's concern turned to anxiousness. He checked his watch and saw that he still had to wait another 20 minutes. He didn't have the patience to wait that long, so he stood up and headed toward the door. "Come on, Ashley. We have to go." But Ashley stopped him at the door. "It hasn't been a half hour yet." "But—" Latham's face was full of worry. "There's no need to be in such a hurry, babe. You're not thinking about terminating it, are you?" She looked at him with serious concern. "Of course not. I want this baby more than anything." He realized that he had probably overreacted, and he apologized to Ashley for worrying her. He took her hand in his. "I'm just worried that there might be something wrong with it. After we, you know." She chuckled and slapped him playfully on the arm. "That doesn't hurt them. It's a myth." He let out a big sigh of relief and smiled. "Thank goodness for that." His smile grew, and he looked at his wife with a kind of warm happiness that she hadn't seen in his eyes before. "I'm going to be a father, and you're going to be a mother." "Actually, it's quite nerve-wracking. What if I'm not a very good mother?" Ever since her first pregnancy had ended in miscarriage, she had been scared to think about trying to get pregnant again. But since it had happened without any planning, it made it easier to accept, and she felt a mix of excitement and worry about what the future might hold. "This is our first time being parents," Latham said. "It's early days, and we still have a lot to learn." He pondered for a moment. "I think I might stop by the bookstore later and pick up some books on parenting that we can read together." "Good idea. Or I could order some online right now." An idea occurred to Latham, and he turned to Helga, who was busy grinding her herbs and trying not to eavesdrop on their conversation. "You know about these things, Helga. What do you need to pay attention to in the early stages of pregnancy?" "Well, the most important thing is probably what an expectant mom puts in her body. So lots of highly nutritious food and absolutely no alcohol. It's a good idea to take folic acid supplements too. And make sure you get a reasonable amount of gentle exercise, but don't overdo it." She winked at them both, and Ashley's face burned with embarrassment. Latham chuckled and grinned at his wife. Then, he wrapped his arms around her and kissed the top of her head. As Helga watched them, she was reminded of the time when Nancy had discovered that she was pregnant and had asked her if she could tell the baby's gender. The thought of having a baby of her own once again crossed her mind. She resolved that she should stop concerning herself with other women's pregnancies. She would raise the subject of her own with Steve as soon as they got back from visiting her mentor's grave in a couple weeks' time. Jonathan found out about his half-sister's pregnancy later that day. He had just come out of a meeting during which he had felt his phone buzzing multiple times with messages. He returned to his office to find out what was going on. There were dozens of messages on a group chat that Nancy had set up sometime earlier. He opened up the chat and started reading from the top. The first message was from Ashley. "Guys, guess what? I'm pregnant." Following the initial message, there were lots more offering Ashley congratulations. There was one from Esther, who joked that if the baby was a girl, she wanted to reserve her for one of her sons. Sydney had said she was shocked and wondered when she would have equally exciting news to share. As Jonathan read, more and more messages kept coming in, and he could barely keep up with them. He rubbed the space between his eyebrows and decided he would ask Nancy to change the name of the group to Babies and Parents. He was about to exit the chat when a particular message caught his eye. His assistant, Jack, had posted a photo of himself with a girl. She was leaning into his shoulder, smiling happily. He looked closely to see if he knew who the woman was, and he was surprised to find that he did. "Isn't that Latham's cousin Mavis?" he thought. He had first met Mavis years earlier, and in his mind, she was still a child. But then he had met her again more recently at Ashley and Latham's wedding. She had been one of Ashley's bridesmaids, and the child had clearly grown into a young woman. Ashley had told him that she had once believed Mavis to be Latham's girlfriend, and there had been some jealousy between them. So now Mavis is with Jack, huh? He hadn't seen that coming. There was no need for Jonathan to post any questions on the chat because everyone else had done that for him. "What the heck? Jack has a girlfriend?" Latham wrote. "And she's my little cousin." "Ha ha ha. Latham, are you the last one to know?" Esther replied. "I was at the hospital with my wife today and didn't go back to the office. Just wait till I see Mavis tomorrow." "Good on you, Jack," was Nancy's comment. "Why don't you post the picture on social media and see how many women's hearts you've broken?" She followed her post with a laughing emoji. "When are you getting married?" Ashley asked. "Now that we're all married, it's getting harder and harder to find unmarried bridesmaids." "What about Steve and Helga?" Nancy remarked. "We should have a group bet on who gets married first, Steve and Helga or Jack and Mavis." "My money's on Helga and Steve," Esther typed. Jonathan read the rest of the bets and smiled helplessly to himself. "You guys really are shameless," he thought, and shook his head in mock despair. A few seconds later, Jack added Mavis to the group chat, and he quickly explained to her that their friends were betting on who would get married first, him or Steve. They were currently tied, but not everyone in the group had voted yet. Just then, Jonathan sent a message in the chat asking Jack to go to his office immediately. There was a silence for a while, but then Esther became active. "LOL, the boss is angry. Jack's about to get into trouble for horsing around instead of working." "Maybe we should create a small private group to place our bets," Latham responded. The message was followed by Ashley's. "Don't forget to include my brother then. He'd hate to be left out." Latham laughed and tapped away on his phone. "Soon, we'll be betting on which one of you women has the biggest stomach." Hannah, who had just finished writing her article, closed her laptop and checked her phone. She was surprised to see so many messages on the group chat. She skimmed through them, and her heart sank. Oh, great. Ashley's pregnant too. Everyone's having kids but me. She had been spending a lot of time with Brock lately, and they had been intimate on several occasions. She had taken a pregnancy test each time afterward, but the result had always been negative. Her eyes fell on the small bottle of medicine on her desk. She grabbed it and put a drop of the liquid on her tongue. She told herself to be patient. Helga had said it would take at least 6 months for the medication to take effect, and then she should try getting pregnant. Hannah wished Brock wasn't so busy with work. He was always going on business trips. When he was home, he tried to spend as much time as he could with her, but she could tell that he was exhausted. She felt guilty about not telling her parents that she and Brock were back together and living in the villa. She had lied to them, saying she was traveling around the country doing research for her magazine, and that she had rented a small apartment in New York. She had thought about getting her own place, but Brock had insisted they live together. The month came to an end, and Steve accompanied Helga to her village as he had promised. They went to visit her mentor's grave one foggy afternoon. They walked on the stone path through the cemetery. The trees were still bare, and there was a chill in the air. Helga stopped in front of a large tombstone, and she carefully laid the flowers she had brought on it. "Sam, I want you to meet Steve, my boyfriend." Her eyes were wet with tears. It was the first time Steve had seen her so emotional. Steve knelt in front of the tombstone. "Hello, Sam. You've done a wonderful job with Helga." She smiled at him gratefully, pleased that he had made the effort to go with her. She knew he hated cemeteries, and it was especially cold and wet that day. She looked down at his expensive shoes, which were covered in mud. He didn't seem to mind, though, and he smiled back at her tenderly. She felt a rush of warmth and love surge through her body. They wiped the grime and dirt off the tombstone, and then they stood there for a while, each absorbed in their thoughts. Just as Helga was about to suggest they leave, Steve grabbed her hand and looked deep into her eyes. "I want to ask you something." "What is it?" His face was flushed as he pulled her under a tall tree. He then got down on one knee, and he looked up at her. "Helga, I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" She stared at him in astonishment without saying a word. He took a deep breath, trying to hide his nervousness. "I promise to take care of you and support you in every way. I admire and respect you, and I can't think of anyone else I'd rather be with." He kissed her hand. "I want to have kids with you. You can teach them everything you know, and I promise to be a good father. We'll have such a wonderful family." He looked searchingly into her eyes, looking for some clue as to how she was feeling. When she still didn't react, he became worried that she would reject him. Finally, he couldn't wait any longer. "Helga, say something. Will you marry me?" Helga met his gaze. He was everything she had ever wanted. Ever since they had started dating, she had been thinking of marriage, but she had been afraid to broach the subject after what had happened the last time. His spontaneous proposal had taken her off guard, but the surprise gradually wore off, and she broke into a wide smile. She caressed his face tenderly. "Of course I'll marry you, Steve. I love you with all my heart." He sighed with relief, and then he suddenly remembered something. He reached into his pocket and took out the engagement ring that he had, which was custom-made for her. Helga held out her hand as he slipped it on her finger. Her eyes shone with excitement. She had never seen anything so beautiful. Her heart started racing, and she felt shy and embarrassed. Steve kissed her hand again. She felt tingly all over. It was as if an electric current had shot through her, awakening all her senses. She stood in front of Steve, unable to move or say anything. "Can I get up now?" he teased, looking up at her. She laughed and helped him to his feet. His designer trousers were covered in grass and mud, but he didn't care. He grabbed her waist, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her passionately. They were lost in the moment, oblivious to the fog and the cold weather. They kissed for a long time, holding on to each other as if they never wanted to let go. Steve finally pulled back, and she could see that his face was wet with tears. "I must be dreaming. I can't believe you're my fiancé," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. As soon as Helga and Steve left the cemetery, he took a picture of the two of them holding hands with Helga's engagement ring clearly visible, and he sent it to their friends. Several messages appeared in the group chat immediately after. Latham was the first one to react. "No way! You two are getting married. I just lost the bet." Nancy was next. "Jack, it looks like Steve beat you to it. P.S. Your boss is with me at the moment, so you can go ahead and respond. Haha." Esther was at home, designing one of her signature bags when she saw the big announcement on her phone. She laughed and quickly typed a message. I almost bet on Jack, but then I changed my mind. I can't believe I was right. We should start collecting the money from the losers. They owe us $20 apiece. Sydney messaged back. Knowing that Jonathan wasn't paying attention to what he was doing at the moment, Jack quickly replied. Don't be so sure that Steve won the bet. Mavis and I are getting our marriage certificate next week. You've got to be kidding. You guys only started dating recently. I bet you haven't even had your first argument yet. Dorian wrote. He was annoyed that everyone around him was getting married and having babies. Things had gone from bad to worse for him ever since Latham and Ashley's wedding. Rose had confronted him angrily because of the night they had spent together in the hotel room in Hawaii. And then, Jonathan had called him to tell him Matthew had passed away. He had flown to Havana right after that, and he had spent a few days with the family before returning to New York. Though he secretly wished Steve would be the first one to get married, he had placed his bet on Jack. But he never expected either to propose to their girlfriends so soon. Jack responded to his message shortly after. I got to know Mavis quite well during the trip to Hawaii, and I think she's a wonderful person. Mavis's message then appeared. I feel the same way about Jack. We met each other's parents the other day, and they gave us their blessing. I don't think we're rushing into anything. We're in love. Nancy smiled when she read their exchange, and she sent a heart emoji. Well then, a big congratulations to both couples. Don't forget to invite us to the wedding. Latham sent another message. Steve, when is the wedding? The bet involved getting married, not just proposing. Steve replied with a laughing emoji. Hold your horses, one step at a time. You better get a move on. Proposing is not the same as getting married. Xavier teased. Esther was confused, so she sent a message to the group. So this means the bet is still on since both couples are engaged, but neither of them is married yet? Nancy responded. That's right. It's up to Jack and Steve now to cross the finish line. Jack, I can convince your boss to give you a day off next week so you can get your marriage certificate if you'd like. Ashley, who was sitting next to Latham on the couch at home, gave him a meaningful look. You should also give Mavis a day off. Jack can't go without her. She then messaged the group. I know for a fact that Helga and Steve aren't in New York at the moment. They went to Helga's village, so there's a good chance Jack and Mavis will get their marriage certificate before they return. How about we up the bet? The others agreed, and they continued to send messages for a while. Helga was so busy staring at the ring on her finger that she wasn't even aware of the group chat. After she and Steve returned to the village, he went to pick up something to eat while she went back to the bed and breakfast they were staying at. She was still somewhat shocked. Her heart was doing flick-flacks, and she felt like jumping up and down with joy. She sat on the bed, hugging a pillow. Her thoughts drifted to their future wedding ceremony, and she decided she would wear the dress her mother had worn at her wedding years ago. She would try it on as soon as she and Steve returned to New York to see if it fit her. If not, she could fix it. She checked her phone, and she discovered that she was part of a group chat full of messages. She scanned through them quickly, surprised to see that their friends were betting on which couple would get married first. The last message was from Esther, who was urging her and Steve to return to New York as soon as possible, so they could get their marriage certificate before Jack and Mavis. Helga sent a reply. We're at a bed and breakfast in my village at the moment, but we're flying back in the morning. It'll be late afternoon by the time we arrive, so I don't think we'll manage to get the certificate tomorrow. Steve was just finishing getting food and on his way back to the room when he saw her message. He slapped his forehead. He couldn't believe she was taking their friends so seriously. He had been planning on getting married on her birthday, which was still 2 months away. He read the silly messages that followed Helga's. Latham was teasing her, asking how far she'd gotten with Steve. Esther also put in her 2 cents worth, telling them to hurry up and get pregnant. Steve hurried back to their room, but saw that Helga wasn't there. When he noticed that her phone was gone and the door to the bathroom was closed, he frowned. He was hoping he'd have a chance to tell her to stop messaging the group about their personal affairs. He called her name, but she didn't hear him since she was running a bath. She was enjoying all the attention they were getting from everyone all of a sudden. She giggled as she typed her response and then sent it. I don't know much about baseball, but I believe we've reached third base and a half. The thumb sent a rolling on the floor laughing emoji. What the heck is that? There's no such thing. Come on, Steve. I'm disappointed. How come you guys haven't had a home run yet? Jack followed up. He's right. What are you two doing at the bed and breakfast? Playing cards? Steve, you can do better. Nancy howled with laughter as she read the exchanges. Stop it, you guys. I'm shaking with laughter and I'm afraid my babies are going to pop out. They must think an earthquake hit them. But the banter didn't stop. I didn't realize Steve was still a virgin, Xavier messaged. Esther snickered. Helga, I hope you anticipate what you have. Not many men are willing to wait until after the wedding. Helga responded. Oh, yes. I'm well aware of what a catch he is. I won't ever let him go. Steve sat on a chair in their room, reading the messages with growing concern. Though he knew everyone was just teasing them, he was tired of always being the butt of their jokes. He wondered if he should just remove himself from the group chat. He finally decided not to until he had given them the satisfaction of knowing that he and Helga had slept together. He looked around the shabby room they were staying in. The bed and breakfast was one of the few in the small village, and it was dirty and unkept. The mattress had broken springs, the carpet was stained, and the entire room smelled of must and cigarette smoke. He couldn't imagine having sex with her for the first time in such a place. He wanted it to be somewhere special. He didn't care about the pressure they were getting to get married. It was nobody's business but their own. They would do things at their own pace, and he would make sure their first time was unforgettable. Steve and Helga had dinner in their room that evening, and they went to bed early, cuddling happily in each other's arms. Both of them felt a bit embarrassed about all the teasing messages they had received from their friends, so the topic of sex didn't even come up. They checked out of the bed and breakfast the next morning, flew back to New York, and quickly fell back into their daily routine. A week later, Jack uploaded a picture of his marriage certificate in the group chat. The ones who had bet on Steve paid the winners, and everyone was incredibly happy to have yet another married couple in the group. 2 months flew by. Nancy was already 8 months pregnant, and her stomach was enormous. She had no idea how she would push 3 babies out of her uterus. Esther was in the middle of her second trimester, and she was thrilled that her morning sickness had finally passed. Ashley, who was only 3 months pregnant, had just started to show. She began to take things easy at the office, going in late and leaving early. She accompanied Latham to Carol's house every evening so Helga could treat his foot injury. On one such occasion, she suddenly remembered that Helga had determined the gender of Nancy and Esther's babies. Her eyes lit up as she turned to her. Helga, can you tell me if my baby's going to be a boy or a girl? She had already had her ultrasound, so she knew she was only having one baby, but the doctor had said it was too soon to tell the baby's gender. Helga smiled and nodded. She did a few quick tests, and then she put her hand on her stomach. It's a girl. Really? Are you sure? That's great. Esther's having 2 boys, and so is Nancy, so this will balance things out a bit. Our daughter's going to be so spoiled. Latham was overjoyed. I was hoping it would be a girl. I even thought of a name for her. Ashley raised her eyebrows. Really? When? When we found out you were pregnant. I was hoping we could call her Cassandra, or Cass, after my great-grandmother. I've always loved that name. Ashley nodded enthusiastically. It's beautiful, Latham. I love it. I guess it's settled then. She was relieved they had chosen a name. She had been thinking about it for a while, and she knew how difficult it was to find the perfect name, especially after talking to Nancy. What if we have a boy later on? That is, if you want to have a second child. Of course I do, but it's up to fate. If we have a boy, I'd name him Lance. Doesn't that sound noble? Like a knight in shining armor. She burst out laughing. It does. Too bad I won't be able to conceive again for at least another year. Esther and Nancy will be having their baby soon. They'll all be older than our kids. Only by a bit. It doesn't matter. Our kids will have older cousins to take care of them. They chatted happily about the future while Hugga recalled what she and Steve had discussed. They were going to get their marriage certificate on her birthday, which was just coming up, and then they would finally consummate their love. She suddenly blushed at the thought, and she turned her face away so Latham and Ashley wouldn't notice. Oliver was at home when his phone rang. When he saw that one of his men he had sent in search of Zoe was calling, he immediately answered. "What is it?" The man seemed to be outside. Oliver could hear the wind howling around him. "Boss, I think we managed to track down Gavin. We used a drone to find him. He's in an abandoned house at the foot of the Sierra Maestra. The drone took a picture of him outside the house just a few minutes ago." Oliver began trembling. "Send me the picture and the exact location. Don't let him or anyone with him see the drone or know that we're watching him. Be very careful. Continue to observe the house and wait for my orders." "Okay, will do, boss." Oliver received the photo moments later, but it was difficult to make out anything since the picture had been taken in the dark. If Gavin's in the mountains, he can't escape very easily, he thought. I need to investigate the location to see if we can surround the house and ambush him. Zoe was inside the house, feeling miserable and frightened. She had never been in such agony. Although Gavin allowed her to go outside for a few hours each day, she spent most of the time in the cold, dark basement. She had been sitting outside the house earlier that day when a snake had suddenly appeared, scaring her out of her wits. She had jumped up and tried to run away, but she hadn't managed to get very far with her huge stomach. She had tripped and fallen after only taking a few steps. Gavin had beaten the snake with a stick, helped her off the ground, and had then taken her back to the basement. She wasn't sure, but she believed that the traumatizing experience had brought on her contractions. They were different from the ones she had had before, and they became more intense and frequent as the evening wore on. She suddenly realized that she must be in labor, and there was a good chance she would deliver the babies that night, even though she wasn't due for another month. Dr. Watts told her to stay calm and take deep breaths as she examined her. Zoe felt that every minute was torture. Her contractions continued throughout the night, but still, the doctor told her she wasn't ready. Neither of them slept. At around 6 in the morning, Dr. Watts finally confirmed that the babies were coming. She ordered the housekeeper to boil some water and bring fresh towels down to the basement. She then asked Gavin to assist her with the delivery. He made a face, but he knelt beside her, trying to keep from fainting. Dr. Watts instructed Zoe on how to breathe and push. Zoe was already exhausted and in excruciating pain from her contractions. But when the doctor told her she could see the baby's head, she mustered all her strength and pushed. Gavin dabbed her forehead with a soft towel as she cried out in pain. "You're doing well, Zoe. Just keep pushing. We're almost there," the doctor said encouragingly. Zoe pushed again, and just when she thought she was going to collapse, she felt the baby slip out. A moment later, the sound of loud crying filled the air. Dr. Watts cut the umbilical cord, wiped the infant clean, and then handed him to Gavin. Zoe felt a wave of emotion wash over her, and she burst into tears. Dr. Watts wiped the sweat from her forehead. "Get ready for the next one. You'll need to keep pushing and breathing. Don't worry, this one's going to be easier." Zoe sat up, focused on the baby in Gavin's arms, and started pushing with all her might. Gavin smiled at the newborn. "You're quite big, aren't you? Bet you can't wait for your sister to arrive." Moments later, the second child was out. Dr. Watts gently slapped her on the back, and she started crying. The housekeeper cleaned the baby with a towel. "What a beautiful pair of twins. Congratulations, Zoe. They look very healthy." Zoe smiled weakly as tears rolled down her cheeks. Zoe watched Gavin as he cradled one of her babies in his arms, wondering how he could be so tender all of a sudden after kidnapping and threatening her. "Surely he's not going to hurt my babies," she thought. "He can't be that big of a monster." She knew that if she ever got out of that nightmare situation alive, she would have to hand her children over to the father. but she didn't care anymore. She just wanted them to be safe and healthy. Oliver's subordinates confirmed that morning that Gavin was inside the abandoned house. The drone had taken pictures of him going out the front door at daybreak to fetch several buckets of water from a nearby well. According to the men who had been watching him carefully, he had been acting strange. Oliver immediately assumed that something must have happened, and then he realized that Zoe must still be alive and had gone into labor. He quickly ordered his subordinates to surround the area, and he drove to the location. It was 10 o'clock when he arrived. At that moment, Zoe had just woken up after a few hours of sleep, and she was breastfeeding the babies. Dr. Watts, who had stayed up all night with her, had dozed off on a beat-up old couch. The housekeeper was busy washing the dirty towels upstairs and making breakfast. Gavin sat by Zoe, watching her intently. "Did you think of names for them?" She nodded. "Yes. I'm going to call the boy Reginald, or Reggie for short, and the girl is Layla." "Are you naming them after family members?" "Yes, my grandparents." "I guess you're going to give them your last name. They certainly can't be named after their father who abandoned them. He obviously doesn't want them anymore." He caressed the little girl's cheek. "Look at her. She looks like an angel, so peaceful and serene. I feel so sorry for her and her brother. They're going to be fatherless for the rest of their lives. What a cruel world we live in." Just then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He took it out and read the message, and his expression changed. He quickly took Layla from Zoe. He looked at Zoe threateningly. "Follow me, or else I'll kill your daughter." She started shaking. "Is he here?" "Yes. He's brought an entire army of men with him." He then went over to Dr. Watts and shook her. "Wake up. Oliver's here. Take the other baby and let's go." She woke up with a start and jumped up, nervous about confronting Oliver, whom she had betrayed. She grabbed the gun on the table, and then she snatched Reggie from Zoe's arms. Although Zoe was exhausted, she managed to pull herself to her feet. She followed Gavin and Dr. Watts upstairs. They snuck out the side entrance of the house and into the forest, following the housekeeper and the 2 trained professional killers Gavin had hired. Though Gavin had set up booby traps and an infrared mechanism around the perimeter to notify him of intruders, Oliver and his men still managed to catch up with him within a short time. Gavin hung on tightly to Layla while he held Zoe's hand and dragged her through the forest. He had an escape plan. But when they arrived at the clearing, he was surprised to discover that his helicopter had been destroyed. They were suddenly surrounded by Oliver's army of 24 men. Just then, Oliver appeared, and he calmly ordered his subordinates to take Zoe and the babies. Zoe stared at him in astonishment. It was the first time she had seen the father of her surrogate children. She had heard about the powerful and rich Williams family, although she rarely watched the news or read gossip columns. Her family was too poor and preoccupied with making ends meet to pay much attention to what happened among the Cuban elite. She observed his handsome features, thinking he looked much older than his age. He had an air of superiority about him, and she wondered whether Reggie would turn out to be like him when he grew up. She recalled how Oliver had chosen Esther over her and her babies, and a chill ran down her spine. Gavin was still holding onto her hand tightly and cradling Layla in his other arm. Just then, Layla started crying, and Reggie, who was in Dr. Watts' arms, followed suit. Oliver noticed the babies wrapped in pink and blue blankets for the first time, and his heart melted. "Those are my kids," he thought. "I have a boy and a girl." He felt a surge of love and tenderness he had never felt before as he listened to the sound of their cries echoing in the mountains. Gavin confronted him. "Stay away from me, or I'll kill them both. I swear." Oliver remained calm. "Just let them go, and I promise not to hurt you. Please, they're just infants." "How about I give you a choice between saving your daughter or saving your son? What's it gonna be?" Furious, Oliver signaled to his subordinates to raise their guns. Dr. Watts immediately reacted by pointing her gun at him. "I'll shoot you in the head if you do anything." The housekeeper, who was standing next to Gavin, also threatened Oliver. "If your men shoot, I'm going to kill your baby boy." Oliver froze, wondering what to do. He didn't want to endanger his children's lives, but he knew he had to get rid of Gavin and his accomplices. They were in a stalemate. Gavin pointed in the direction of the cliff on the other side of the clearing. "Okay, Oliver, you scumbag. I'll give you another choice. I'll let both of your kids live in exchange for your life. You killed my sister, so now I want you to jump off that cliff. I swear on Mackenzie's grave that if you don't do it, I'll throw your kids into the abyss instead." Gavin shook with rage as he confronted Oliver. He was gripping Zoe's wrist so hard that she thought he would break it. Though it hurt, she was more afraid of Oliver at that moment. She didn't know that he had killed Gavin's sister, and she had no reason to suspect that Gavin was lying. She stared at Oliver in wide-eyed astonishment, wondering how she could give birth to such a monster's children. She could live with the fact that Oliver had left them to die, but she couldn't accept being a surrogate mother for a murderer. She suddenly regretted her decision to bear his children. She watched the standoff between Oliver and Gavin, wondering who would be the first to surrender. She then looked at Layla, who had cried her lungs out and was fast asleep at the moment. Reggie had also quieted down. Zoe's eyes filled with tears as she realized that she had only had the chance to hold them once since their birth. Just then, the silence was broken by the sound of a gunshot. Zoe turned her head to see Dr. Watts holding a smoking gun. The doctor was so nervous that she fired a shot in the air. Another gunshot rang out, followed by a loud groan. Dr. Watts fell to the ground, holding Reggie. One of Oliver's subordinates ran across the clearing, grabbed the baby, and ran him to Oliver. Zoe looked first at them, and then at Dr. Watts, lying on the ground, dead, with a bullet in her skull. Her eyes were wide open, and the gun was still in her hand. "Gavin, I'm going to count to 10. Oliver threatened. "If you don't hand over Zoe and my daughter, I'm afraid I'll have to shoot you and the rest of your accomplices. It's your choice." Gavin trembled in fear. He was holding on to Zoe with one hand and had Layla in his other arm, so his hands were tied. Though his housekeeper and his two professional killers were pointing their guns at Oliver, they were clearly outnumbered by his rival subordinates. He forced himself to calm down, and he looked Oliver straight in the eye. "Don't you dare tell me what to do. I'm the one who'll count to 10. If you don't get out here this instant, I'll kill your baby." There was a faint buzzing sound in the air, but Gavin was too preoccupied to notice it. High above them, a sniper drone was aiming straight at them. Zoe stared unblinkingly at Oliver, who was holding Reggie. She could see the love and tenderness in his eyes as he glanced down at his son. But when he looked up at her and smiled, she recoiled. She had a sudden feeling that she would die that day. Somehow she would end up in the crossfire and she would be shot. She just hoped her daughter would be spared. At least Reggie was safe with his father. She wanted to make sure he would remain safe. She finally gathered the courage to say something. "Oliver, no matter what happens to me today, promise me you'll take care of your son Reggie. Treat him well and give him all the love he deserves." She hoped that Oliver would stand down and leave them be. He stared at her in astonishment, as if noticing her for the first time. She looked so different from the pictures he had seen of her. Her eyes were swollen and had dark circles underneath. Her face was covered in tears, and she seemed to him a frightened, desperate young girl. He looked down at his son, sleeping in his arms. "His name's Reggie?" She nodded, and was about to say something else when Gavin yanked on her arm and pulled her away. Just then, the buzzing sound became louder. Without warning, Gavin's housekeeper suddenly collapsed. The drone had shot her down, and she lay motionless on the ground with her gun in her hand. Before Zoe could react, Gavin pushed her forcefully in front of him, shouting at Oliver. "That's it! My patience is gone! I'm warning you. If you don't leave us alone, I'm going to jump off the cliff and take Zoe and your daughter with me." He inched toward the edge of the cliff, dragging Zoe with him. She turned her head in horror and looked down at the abyss below them. She tried to break free, but Gavin held onto her tightly. Layla was still sleeping in his arms, blissfully unaware of what was happening. A strong wind blew across the clearing. Zoe could only picture herself falling into the deep abyss of nothing with her baby. She turned to Layla, thinking it would be the last time she saw her. Gavin looked at her apologetically. "I'm sorry, Zoe. I have no choice. I knew Oliver and his men would eventually find us no matter where we escaped. So I chose this spot. It's the only way out. I don't care if I die, as long as I take one of that bastard's kids with me." Zoe's eyes were wet with tears. She held out her arms. "Please, can I at least hold her one last time and say goodbye?" He nodded and handed her the baby. She hugged Layla close to her body, kissing her head and whispering tender words of love. Nothing mattered at that moment except the feeling of holding her child in her arms. All of a sudden, Gavin yanked Zoe's arm, and the three of them fell backward off the cliff. Oliver rushed forward, his eyes filled with shock and pain. He stared over the edge of the cliff and watched helplessly as they fell. His subordinates were busy dragging away the housekeeper and Dr. Watts' dead bodies. One of them approached Oliver. "Boss, the two assassins managed to escape during the shooting. We'll go and look for them and report back as soon as we found them." Oliver slowly nodded absent-mindedly. His eyes were fixated on Zoe and his baby daughter hundreds of feet below. Stuart, who was also among the group, was next to approach him. "Let me take Reggie. There's a cold wind blowing. You don't want him to catch a cold." Oliver suddenly came to his senses and he turned around. His eyes were red and his voice was hoarse. "Let's go back." The nursery had been prepared long before the birth of Oliver's children. Oliver had also hired a nanny to care for them. Reggie curled up his little nose and sneezed a few times. He had been fed and was fast asleep. A soft lamp illuminated the quiet room. Oliver stood beside the bassinet and gazed at the sleeping infant, swaddled tightly in a muslin cloth. Reggie slept peacefully, unaware that he had been separated from his mother and twin sister a few hours earlier. Oliver sat down quietly on a small stool. Reggie's young and delicate face seemed like it could break if touched, and although Oliver wanted to hold his tiny fingers, he felt as though his hands were stained with blood. Those around him had all either died or come to harm. Even Zoe had experienced misfortune and had lost her life because of him. The sleeping infant was the most fragile treasure in the world to him. He felt his heart soften. He wanted to be closer to his child, but was afraid he might hurt him. Oliver lost track of time, lost in thought, when suddenly Reggie's face wrinkled up and he started to cry. The nanny, Leah, hurried into the room. "I think he has a wet diaper. Let me check." She gently picked him up and carried him to the compactum. Reggie cried and squirmed as she changed his diaper. She swaddled him again and held him close against her chest. She softly patted him on the back until he settled and closed his eyes. Aware of Oliver's gaze, Leah turned to him. "Would you like to hold him?" Oliver hesitated. "No, it's fine." She realized that he was nervous and smiled at him. "Don't worry, you won't wake him up." Oliver shrugged. "I'm not very good with babies." He felt slightly awkward. Leah knew about Oliver's reputation as a hard and callous man. His reluctance to hold Reggie surprised her. She didn't know about Zoe or what had happened to her, but it was evident that the infant no longer had a mother. She felt sorry for Oliver, a first-time father raising a child alone. She walked across the room and placed Reggie in Oliver's arms. "There you go. Holding a baby is easy. Just be sure to support his neck." The tiny infant weighed less than 6 pounds, but Oliver felt like he was holding a priceless treasure. He held Reggie carefully, afraid he might drop him. But the child slept peacefully, and Oliver discovered it wasn't as difficult to hold a baby as he had imagined. The nanny smiled at him. He knows he's safe in his father's arms. Oliver looked down at the sleeping baby boy. His mouth curved into a soft smile as he gazed at Reggie's long eyelashes and dark hair. He thought about his daughter and Zoe and felt a lump in his throat. He wondered if his daughter had been as cute as her twin brother was. He sighed sadly. He had sent his men to find their bodies, but they still had no news and continued their search. The cliff was dangerous and steep. He shuddered when he considered what might have happened to them. He knew there was no chance they had survived the fall. Oliver lowered his head and kissed his baby softly on the forehead. Now that he only had his son, he vowed to give him everything he needed. Even though he worried he wouldn't be a good father, he would try his best. He also decided to compensate Zoe's family well enough to ensure they would never have to go without. Oliver registered Reggie's birth the following day. The child was officially named Reginald Arthur Williams. He stared at Reggie's birth certificate for a long time, wondering what Zoe had named his daughter. She hadn't had the time to tell him. The news of Reggie's birth was kept private, and not many people in Havana knew about it. Oliver's household staff noticed that he came home earlier in the afternoons and seemed friendlier than before. He also spent a lot of time with Reggie. Thousands of miles away, Nancy bid a teary farewell to her Bright Star colleagues. It was time for her to start her maternity leave so she could rest before the babies were born. She was already 8 months pregnant, and her belly was enormous from carrying triplets. Emma hurried over to her as she was about to leave. She handed her a bag of gifts. "Maria, I caught you just in time. This is for your babies." Nancy nodded and smiled. "Thank you. You must visit us after they're born." Emma shook her head. "I'd love to, but I might not have the time. I've got a huge deadline to meet." Nancy knew that Emma had made up an excuse not to visit because she worried about running into Katie. "All the best with your work, Emma. We'll have a small party to celebrate their birth later on. I'm sure you'll find time to join us. Besides, Katie's more resilient than you think. She's bounced back and has thrown herself into her schoolwork." Emma sighed with relief. She had been worried about Katie, but had felt too embarrassed to say anything about it. It was an awkward situation. She patted Nancy gently on the arm. "Okay, I promise to visit. By the way, I used my bonus to buy a house. I want to renovate it first before I have a housewarming party." Nancy smiled politely. She had heard that Emma had bought a house. The Valkyrie had done exceptionally well in the markets, and the core research and development staff had received a generous bonus for their efforts. They had also received bonuses for the success of Galaxy Fortune and Creation. Many employees had taken the opportunity to invest in property and had bought houses. Nancy's eyes twinkled. "Congratulations on your first house. I'm sure the triplets will be old enough to visit after the renovations are complete. It'll be fun." She greeted a few more people as she walked through the office for the last time, and then met the driver outside to take her home. Harold had also returned to New York and greeted Nancy when she arrived home. His hands were dirty, and he had sawdust on his pants. He had been carving something and held a woodworking tool. He grinned and pointed to the small wooden toy cars on the table. Nancy gasped and picked one of them up. "Dad, did you make these? They're exquisite." Harold beamed. "I don't have much else to do with my time. I figured I could make my grandson some toys to play with." Nancy looked at him proudly. "I love them." She turned the car over and looked at it more carefully. Suddenly, an idea crossed her mind. "I can install a small chip and battery inside to turn it into a voice control car." Harold laughed. "Jonathan warned me that you're a workaholic. You should be resting, not thinking of ways to improve wooden toy cars." She playfully stuck her tongue out at him. "I just want to encourage my babies to develop an interest in technology from an early age." Jonathan also just arrived home and had brought a bag of Nancy's favorite treats. He had important news. "There's so much exciting news today. Oliver's son was born yesterday, and Steve and Helga are getting married today." It was Helga's birthday, and Steve took her to the marriage license office. They were a good-looking couple, and everyone recognized Steve as soon as he entered the building. Within minutes, someone had posted a photograph on social media. The deputy director of the Davis Group has been spotted at the marriage license office. He has a beautiful woman on his arm, and we suspect they're getting married." The photograph was grainy and of poor quality, but one could see Steve holding Helga's hand, and he had a pack of documents tucked under his arm. It was evident that they were there to get married. The internet buzzed with excitement. Fans of Steve lamented that yet another eligible bachelor had succumbed to marriage. Steve and Helga had a quick ceremony in court and said their vows. Then, they went into a small office to have photographs taken. The photographer beamed when he saw them. He was a perfectionist and didn't stop taking pictures until he was satisfied he had gotten the best shot possible. "Okay, sit down. The groom can put his arm around his bride. Smile. Smile wider. What a beautiful bride. She has such a lovely smile. Let's try that again. I need the groom to look happy. You're getting married. Look excited." Steve felt he wanted to give the photographer a piece of his mind, but when he saw Helga's broad smile, his eyes lit up and he grinned. Helga began to laugh, and the photographer cheered her on. "That's great. The groom is finally looking good. Look at those lovely white teeth." Steve's face darkened. The photographer was working on his nerves. He had only smiled because he had found Helga's smile amusing. The photographer seemed oblivious to Steve. He tapped on his laptop and called them to look at the photographs. Steve's annoyance instantly evaporated. In the photo that he showed them, Helga was smiling sweetly and her eyes were shining. Steve's grin lit up his cold eyes, making him look the happiest he'd ever been. Helga thanked the photographer and he printed a few copies of some of the photos for them. They then went to get their marriage certificates stamped. The clerk congratulated them and handed them their marriage certificate. Unable to contain herself, Helga giggled and clasped Steve's hand. He turned to her and grinned. "It looks like you're happy to be married to me." Her eyes sparkled. "Yeah." He gave her a lopsided grin and thought about how quickly his life had changed. He suddenly felt emotional and choked back his tears. Helga remembered that she wanted to post a photo on the group chat, so she quickly made Steve pose for another photo. They held up their marriage certificate and smiled for a selfie. Dorian was the first to comment moments after Helga had posted the photo. "Congratulations!" Helga responded with a smiley emoji. Rose, who hadn't been active on the group chat for a while, was the second to send a message of congratulations. "How exciting! Welcome to the family, Helga." Dorian took the opportunity to chat with Rose. "Hi, Rose. What's up?" Rose wasn't interested in making small talk with him. "None of your business. Get lost." The chat group began to buzz, and Rose and Dorian's squabble soon got lost in the flood of messages. Nancy had been busy with Harold and hadn't seen the messages until Jonathan had hurried over to her and told her the news. She picked up her phone and saw several messages of congratulations. "It looks like Steve's finally going to have a home run," she commented. Latham also replied, "It's your turn now, Steve. Helga, you better hurry up if you want your baby to go to kindergarten with ours." Esther replied to Nancy's message with a kissing face emoji. "I'm with you on the home run." Xavier nudged Esther and nuzzled his face into her neck. "How about hitting a home run with me?" She pulled away from him and giggled. Everyone in the group chat added a comment or two, and keeping up with all the messages soon became impossible. Hannah stared at the messages in silence, lost in thought, when suddenly her phone began to ring. It was an international call. She hesitantly picked it up and answered. "Hello?" The voice at the end of the line sounded excited. "Hello, is this Miss Marsh?" Hannah frowned. "Yeah, this is her." "Miss Marsh, on behalf of the International Writing Competition, we'd like to congratulate you on coming second." Hannah kept silent for a moment, stunned. Then, she squealed with delight and happily grinned from ear to ear. It had taken her over a year and a half to complete the piece she had written for her competition entry. She had traveled to several cities and towns to gather information about their cultural habits, and it had taken her a long time to assimilate everything. She had waited patiently for months after her submission to hear who had won, but had eventually given up. Winning second place had come as an enormous surprise. She immediately forgot about her struggle to conceive. The good news was exactly what she needed to get out of the slump she had been in. She opened the group chat and quickly typed, "Congratulations! Don't forget to tell us about your home run tomorrow." Latham replied within seconds, "Hey, Hannah. I'm glad to see you're still alive. We haven't heard from you in ages." Helga read all the messages and blushed profusely. She and Steve had only been together for a few months. They had kissed and almost given in to their desire for one another, but she realized it was time to take the final step. They had gotten married, and that night would be their wedding night. She turned her phone face down and stared out of the window. Steve was driving, and he didn't notice. He turned into a residential suburb and drove down a quiet street lined with trees and neat houses. Helga looked around, puzzled. "Where are we going, hubby?" Steve heard her call him hubby for the first time and felt his heart in his throat. He tightened his fingers around the steering wheel and replied calmly, "We're going home. I bought a house a long time ago and thought we could live here if you'd like." Helga nodded. She realized she had never asked him if he owned a house. She hadn't thought about it. He drove to a house at the end of the street and parked the car in the driveway. He quickly got out and hurried around the car to open the door for Helga. She had already unbuckled her seatbelt and was about to open the door herself. He shrugged and helped her out. They walked up a few stairs to the front door. Steve swiped his finger in the scanner and the door unlocked. "Helga, this is our new home. You're welcome to move in whenever you're ready." She looked at him with wide, excited eyes, but before she entered, she paused and asked, "Why don't you call me any cute names like wifey?" Steve became quiet and looked down. "It doesn't matter what I call you, does it?" Helga took his hand and clasped it in between hers. "I want to hear you say it." Steve stared at Helga with an embarrassed look on his face. He pushed the door open and gently nudged her. "You go in first." Helga nodded and walked into the house. It was modern and neat. The walls were light gray with black trims on the doors and window frames. Sunlight shone through the large windows, making the rooms bright and sunny. Ceiling lights and sconces helped lighten up the dark color palette. It was sparsely furnished, with only a small table and 2 chairs in the kitchen. Steve looked around. "It needs some green. I had this place renovated before I met you. I can't do much about the layout, but you can change the wall color or add some greenery and decor." Helga listened to him, and it slowly dawned on her. She and Steve had a house of their own. She had a place to make into a home. It wasn't a tiny shack in the woods. It was her home in New York. She looked at him with a worried expression. "I'm so sorry." He turned to her, confused. "Why?" She lowered her eyes and spoke softly. "Because I have so little. You've given me a house, and I have nothing to give you in return. I feel inferior." He put his arm around her. "You're a silly girl." She looked up at him and forced a smile. His eyes locked with hers. "It's not about the money. Unless you married me for my money?" She shook her head. "No, of course not. I married you because I love you." Steve chuckled. "So where's the problem? I love you too. You're more valuable to me than anything else I could ever have. Even if you had all the money in the world, I wouldn't have married you if I didn't love you." Helga blinked. A feeling of warmth and happiness washed over her. When she had first come to New York, she had been so busy being a doctor that she hadn't thought much about money and status. As her relationship with Steve had developed, she had become immersed in his world and realized the importance of wealth and social status in the upper-class society. She gazed into his eyes and realized she had no reason to feel unworthy of his love. She didn't have to worry about their vastly different backgrounds. He loved her for who she was, and that was enough. He rubbed her hair and kissed her forehead. "You're the best." Helga bit her bottom lip and smiled. She looked around the room and sighed happily. She had a husband and a home. Her heart was about to burst with joy. She looked around the empty living room and kitchen. She didn't want to change anything. Everything was perfect as it was. Is there a garden outside? I'd love to start an herb garden. He nodded. There's plenty of space for that. He had heard people saying that a happy spouse made a happy house. He used to shudder at the saying, but now he finally understood. Helga hurried to the patio doors and opened them. She stared into the yard and began to plan her herb garden. Then she turned around and went upstairs. The only furnished room upstairs was the main bedroom. The other rooms were still empty, and Helga excitedly walked through each room as she planned what to do with them. Steve followed her and eagerly listened to her ideas. They eventually reached the main bedroom. Helga sighed. I like the color of the carpet. I'll have to find matching curtains. Steve nodded. Yeah, that'll look good. He gazed at the bed. She walked into the bathroom, and her voice echoed as she excitedly noticed the size of the bath. It's huge, and it has a massage function. Steve gulped. Yeah. She continued to look around and opened the balcony window to look outside into the garden. I'll plant a fruit tree beneath the balcony. We'll be able to pick fruit from the bedroom one day. Steve mumbled absent-mindedly. Yeah, sure. Helga didn't notice. She closed the window and opened the walk-in closet. There's so much space. You take the left-hand side, and I'll take the right. She still had her hand on the closet door handle when Steve put his hand over hers. Helga frowned. Why is your palm so hot? Let me take your temperature. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his forehead. It seems a little... She stopped and looked up at him, and immediately knew what was wrong with him. His eyes burned with desire for her. He bit his lip. Please, continue. Helga was about to answer when she felt the warmth of his lips against hers. He turned his body and pressed her against the closet door. The door was hard, but all she felt was the heat of his body burning into hers. He kissed her passionately, almost impatiently. She was distracted by his embrace and was no longer concerned about his temperature. She could feel him becoming warmer, and she felt breathless. She felt like she was melting into him. She pulled back slightly for a breath of air. Their foreheads touched, and she felt his warm breath against her skin. Her body tingled all over. His voice was hoarse as he whispered, Do I have a fever? She raised her eyes and looked into his. Her mind was blank, and she couldn't focus. I didn't feel your forehead properly. Steve smiled. Is that so? His cold and indifferent manner had changed. He looked at her intently. Why don't you try one more time? He kissed her again. Helga's fingers trembled as she tried to feel his temperature again. She couldn't concentrate. She focused on her breathing and the heat of their bodies touching. Steve kissed her and led her across the room. She lost her balance and fell backward. He caught her and wrapped his arm around her waist. He continued to kiss her until they reached the bed. He gently took her hand from his forehead. You can check my temperature later. She nodded in a daze. He kissed her again, this time with more intensity and longing. She wanted to tell him she couldn't take his temperature if he kept kissing her, but he didn't give her a chance. She gave up and allowed him to push her onto the bed. It was still light outside. Thoughts flashed through her mind and then disappeared. She closed her eyes and imagined fireworks exploding in the starry sky. She felt his muscular body against hers and smelled the sweet scent of the cologne on his skin. He kissed her neck. What do you think of our new bed? She nodded and looked at him for a moment before lowering her eyes. You haven't called me your wife yet. Helga had been raised in a conservative town. It was traditional to call each other husband and wife after getting married. It was a rite of passage, something that she felt was missing. Steve frowned with disappointment. He struggled to understand why she insisted on it and why it was important to her. "Helga, is it necessary?" She looked up at him. "Yes, it is." Her eyes were wet, and he saw his reflection in them. He felt a lump in his throat. His voice was hoarse. "Wife, my darling wife." He ran his fingers through her hair and kissed her tenderly. His wife was a stubborn woman. Helga beamed. Her eyes lit up and twinkled with joy. He chuckled softly and felt his body burn with desire for her. He embraced her passionately, and she surrendered to him. Helga lay in Steve's arms. He looked down at her long eyelashes, laughed softly, and hugged her tightly. He felt as if he had just won first prize. The months of longing and yearning to be with her were over. She smiled, buried her head in his chest, and fell asleep. It was already late by the time Helga woke up. She opened her eyes and found herself cradled in Steve's arms. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he held his arms around her. She smiled and sighed slowly. She moved slightly, and Steve immediately opened his eyes. He hadn't been sleeping at all. Helga whispered, "Are you awake, hubby?" Steve leaned over and kissed her. "Yeah, Mrs. Davis." Helga giggled and stretched her legs. She realized they had finally hit a home run. She sighed and thought about their passionate lovemaking. It struck her that she could easily fall pregnant if they didn't take precautions. Her fainting spells hadn't gone away, and she would have to be more careful if she did fall pregnant. Steve wasn't aware of Helga's thoughts about the future. He lowered his head. "Are you hungry?" Helga nodded. She looked out at the night sky and frowned. "It must be late." He smiled at her. "I ordered takeout when you were sleeping." He slid his arm out from under her body and sat up. "I'll go downstairs and heat it up in the microwave." She rolled onto her side and also sat up. She realized that they were both naked, and she suddenly blushed. She gazed at his tanned figure and felt herself become hot and sweaty. The scenes from earlier replayed in her mind, and she took a deep breath. Steve didn't notice her deep scarlet complexion because he had his back to her. But he suddenly felt nervous and fumbled with his clothing. Helga watched the muscles on his back and arms flex as he bent over to pull up his pants, and she bit her bottom lip. He turned around, and his eyes met hers. She quickly looked away. He smiled. "Were you watching me get dressed?" She nodded coyly. She didn't know whether she should admit it or not. He walked to the edge of the bed. "Did you like what you saw?" She blushed even more. Steve put his hands on the bed and leaned over to kiss her. He finally understood what it meant to savor the moment. It had been her first time, and he had been gentle with her. They hadn't eaten since they had left the marriage license office, and he was hungry. He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ears, kissed her again, and went downstairs to the kitchen. Helga waited for him to leave before wrapping a blanket around her body. She got out of bed and gathered her clothing. Her heart beat fast, and her cheeks were still red. She dressed quickly and went into the bathroom to splash cold water on her face before going downstairs to find Steve. Her legs trembled as she slowly descended the staircase one step at a time. She had a bittersweet feeling in her heart. The life she had always known had changed, and she had a new future to look forward to. Steve had already heated their dinner and laid everything on the small table. He pulled out a chair for her and then sat across from her. He opened a bottle of red wine and poured 2 glasses. He smiled and lifted his glass. "To my beautiful wife, I love you." Her heart skipped a beat, and she gazed at his handsome face. She couldn't believe how happy and content she felt. She clinked her glass against his. "I love you too, my husband." They ate their first meal together as husband and wife and chatted happily about how they would decorate the house, which plants Helga wanted to grow in the herb garden, and their future together. They eventually went back upstairs to sleep. Steve embraced her tightly, and she saw passion burning fiercely in his eyes. It was almost midday by the time Helga woke up. She gasped and remembered they were supposed to visit his mother. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, ready to get dressed, but Steve pulled her back and kissed her tenderly. Jonathan and Nancy sat in Carol's living room and made polite small talk. They were waiting for Steve and Helga to arrive. Everyone knew that they had gone to their new house after going to get their marriage license. So it was no surprise when the couple arrived fashionably late. Helga walked up to Carol and Sophia and greeted them politely. "Hello, grandmother and mother-in-law." She then turned to greet Jonathan and Nancy. "Hello, Uncle Jonathan and Aunt Maria." Jonathan's lips twitched as if he wanted to say something. Instead, he handed her a small gift box wrapped in pretty paper. "Congratulations on your marriage, and welcome to the family." Nancy looked at Helga in astonishment. Although she knew Helga had been raised to honor strict traditions, she hadn't expected to be addressed as an aunt. Carol was the first to break the silence. "This young lady was raised properly. I'm impressed that she knows how to respect her new family." Steve rubbed his forehead in frustration. "Grandma, this is the modern era. We don't have to do things like that anymore." He tugged at Helga and dragged her out of the room. Everyone started to laugh. Sophia folded her hands in her lap. "My son has no manners." Nancy chuckled. "Helga is headstrong. She'll say what she wants. I don't think he can stop her." She rummaged in her handbag for her phone and quickly typed a message on the group chat. "Home run for Steve and Helga." The group chat exploded with comments asking Nancy to elaborate. She happily obliged. They disappeared after getting their marriage certificate yesterday, and they were late for lunch at Carol's. I took an educated guess. Jonathan reached over and snatched her phone from her. He put it in his pocket and glared at her. "You're an aunt. You should behave like one." She looked at him speechlessly for a second before she started to laugh. Nancy and Jonathan went home after enjoying a light lunch to welcome Helga into the Davis family. Jonathan insisted that Nancy stay home and not travel to the city for work. He was concerned that the babies would be born at any moment, and he didn't want to let her out of his sight. She spent her time resting and attended the occasional business meeting virtually. Jack, who lived with them in their mansion, frequently left to visit Mavis. Being in love seemed to have softened him slightly, and he had a sparkle in his eyes. One morning, Nancy had just finished eating breakfast and was about to go for a walk when she felt a stabbing pain in her abdomen. She had become used to having minor contractions and didn't think too much about it at first. But after a few minutes, she realized the contractions were different, and then she felt her water break. She sat down on the couch and began to breathe heavily. She shouted for Jonathan, who was in his study. "It's time! The babies are coming!" Jonathan dropped everything he was busy with and hurried over to her. Harold heard the commotion and quickly ran downstairs. They helped Nancy up and supported her to the car. Jonathan instructed the driver to take them to the hospital. Nancy clutched her belly and huffed, trying to control her breathing. Jonathan sat next to her and held her hand. Harold sat in front and urged the driver to drive faster. When Esther heard that Nancy's water had broken, she insisted that Xavier take her to the hospital, but he refused. "You're too far along. Running around a hospital in your state won't be good for you. We'll visit her at home after the babies are born. She'll be okay." Esther reluctantly agreed. "Okay, fine. I'll stay. But you have to go. Keep me updated. I want to know everything." Xavier shrugged. He knew his wife well enough not to argue. He told the housekeeper to keep an eye on her, and he rushed to the hospital. Maria's siblings, Henry and Venus, were also on their way. Henry had just returned to the city to participate in a modeling competition. When Jonathan had called him to say Nancy was on her way to the hospital, he had quickly called Venus and Angela. But Angela had recently gotten married and had a child of her own, and her baby was still too small, so she had to stay home. Hannah saw the message on the group chat that Nancy had gone into labor. She had been working on the next episode of her column and she felt a sense of mixed emotions. She looked out the window and remembered how it felt to be pregnant. The pain of being unable to conceive cut through her like a knife. She took a deep breath and quickly closed her laptop before hurrying out of the house. As she got into her car, she messaged Brock to tell him the news. The Davis Group owned shares in the hospital, and Jonathan had arranged for a private ward and had booked the largest waiting room. Even so, the room was overcrowded, with all their friends eagerly waiting for the babies to be born. Ashley arrived shortly after Hannah. She had been at work in the Davis Group's offices nearby. She had already started to show, and she rubbed her hands over her little bump. She smiled when she saw Hannah. "Hello. I've just run into the doctor. He says Nancy's dilated, and it won't be much longer." Hannah glanced at the delivery room door. She felt a rush of emotion stir deep within her. In the delivery room, Jonathan stood beside Nancy and held her hand. He chatted to her about nonsense to keep her mind off the pain of labor. Beads of sweat gathered on her forehead, and she breathed heavily with each contraction. He constantly told her how much he loved her and wished he could help her. All he could do was hold her hand and tell her how excited he was to become a father. The doctor examined Nancy and had a short discussion with the nurse. He then turned to Nancy. "I think it's safe to proceed with a natural birth. The first baby is already engaged, and it's time to start pushing. We'll consider a cesarean if we run into trouble. But so far, everything looks fine." Nancy nodded. She looked at Jonathan wide-eyed and cried in pain when she felt another sharp contraction. Jonathan went pale and gulped. "Are you sure about this? Why don't we ask for a cesarean?" Nancy shook her head. The doctor checked her again and smiled. "It's almost time. You're doing great." Nancy clenched her jaw and squeezed Jonathan's hand. "It'll be okay. I'll hold on for a bit longer." It felt like an eternity had passed, and Nancy thought she would faint from the excruciating pain. Just as she was about to give up, the doctor exclaimed, "The first baby is crowning. It's time to push." Nancy's entire body shook, and she clutched Jonathan's hand. The color drained from her face, and he looked at her nervously. He felt his palm drip with sweat, but wasn't sure if it was his or Nancy's. "Don't be afraid. Do as the doctor says." He felt his throat tighten, and he didn't know who was more afraid, him or Nancy. The nurse had prepared 3 small cots for the newborns, and the doctor got into position to help Nancy deliver her babies. Nancy felt an intense contraction that rippled through her entire body. She moaned and wailed in pain. There was a moment of silence, and then the unmistakable cry of a newborn baby rang through the air. Before going into labor, Nancy had hoped that her 2 boys would arrive first, but at that moment, when she heard her baby crying, she didn't care who came first, as long as they all came out healthy. The obstetrician gave her a big smile. "Congratulations! The first one's a boy." He handed the baby to the nurse so she could wipe him dry, and then he turned his attention back to Nancy. "Don't worry, the other 2 will be much easier. Keep pushing. You're almost there." Jonathan glanced at the baby in the nurse's arms, but he was focusing on his wife. He dabbed at her sweaty face with a towel. The doctor was right. The second baby arrived a few minutes later, and the sound of loud cries filled the delivery room once more. Nancy collapsed onto her pillow, thinking she would pass out if she had to continue. Jonathan was worried she wouldn't get through it. He leaned over and kissed her gently on the forehead. "Come on, sweetheart. Just 1 more to go, and then you can rest." She nodded, wincing in pain. She used her remaining strength to push the last baby out. The obstetrician grinned. "Wonderful. You have a beautiful baby girl. Her lungs are even stronger than her brother's." Nancy didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She was so exhausted that she wanted to fall asleep and never wake up. Jonathan held her hand tightly as he kissed her on the cheek, ignoring the sweat and the tears. "You did it, my love. Get some rest now, and don't worry about a thing." She nodded, looking around the room for the babies. The first one had already been cleaned and wrapped in a white blanket. The nurse showed him to Nancy and Jonathan. "Here's your eldest son. He's 4 pounds and 6 ounces. Isn't he the most adorable thing you've ever seen?" Nancy stared at her child's red face and wrinkled skin, and she didn't think he was as adorable as the nurse claimed. She desperately hoped he had inherited Jonathan's good looks. How can he not? She thought. I'm attractive, and Jonathan has impeccable features. All 3 of our children should end up looking stunning. The second nurse finished cleaning the other 2 infants, and she took them over to Jonathan and Nancy. "Meet your other lovely son and your lovely daughter." Nancy looked at each one in turn, thinking they all looked the same. She couldn't even distinguish between the boys and the girl, but she was relieved to see that they were all healthy. She breathed a sigh of relief, lay back on her pillow, and closed her eyes. The nurses placed the babies in their own little cribs, and they pushed it over to Jonathan. "Come on, it's time to take your wife and your triplets to their room." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. His eyes fell on Nancy, who was sound asleep, and he felt an incredibly powerful wave of love wash over him. He had never thought he would live long enough to become a father. His brothers had all passed away at a young age, so he had naturally believed that he would have a similar fate. He had lived recklessly for years, never caring about the consequences of his actions or who he hurt. And then he met Nancy, who had turned his world upside down. He had learned to become loving, patient, and kind, and to cherish life. All he had wanted was to spend the rest of his life with her. Thankfully, his prayers had been answered. He had recovered from his blood condition, and he no longer had to worry about dying young. He was in his early 30s, and he had made 3 beautiful children with the love of his life. He followed the obstetrician and the nurses as they pushed Nancy and the baby cribs out of the delivery room. Their group of friends and family members jumped up when they saw them, and they rushed over to see the babies. Jonathan put his fingers to his lips, signaling to them to keep quiet so as not to wake Nancy. He accompanied the obstetrician and Nancy into the private room while the nurses remained in the hallway with the triplets. The group surrounded the crib, quietly whispering. Harold's eyes filled with tears as he looked down at the tiny bundles of joy. He had never really been close to his family in Cuba, so he was thrilled to have not just a daughter and a son-in-law, but 3 grandchildren as well. Helga watched the baby sleeping, tempted to pick one of them up, but not daring to. Latham, who stood next to her, teased her, saying she and Steve should hurry up and conceive so they could have one of their own. He then put his hand on Ashley's stomach and smiled tenderly at her. Hannah stood a few feet away, staring at the babies longingly. She had called Brock as soon as she had heard that Nancy had gone into labor, and he had rushed to the hospital from the office. Everyone was smiling and chatting animately, but she couldn't bring herself to be happy. She looked off into space, trying hard not to break down and cry. Brock put his arms around her shoulder to comfort her. He knew how desperately she wanted to get pregnant. He had seen the dozens of negative pregnancy tests in the garbage at home, even though she was always careful to wrap them neatly in tissue paper. He never pressed her about it, thinking she would talk to him when she was ready. Though he would never admit it to her, he was secretly pleased that she hadn't gotten pregnant because he was so busy at work. The last thing he needed was a baby in his life. He was perfectly happy to wait another few years. If Hannah still couldn't get pregnant by then, they would adopt a child. He knew they would eventually have to have one. Otherwise, her parents would never accept him. He kissed the top of her head and patted her shoulder. "It's okay, Han. Don't worry. Everything's going to be fine." She looked up at him, and he could see the pain in her eyes. "Do you have to go back to the office later?" "No. I finished with my work for the day." He had canceled 2 of his meetings when she had called him and asked him to meet her at the hospital. He had known that it wouldn't be easy for her, and he wanted to be there for her. Brock squeezed Hannah's hand. "You know, you could be a godmother to one of Nancy's and Jonathan's kids." She smiled. "I'd rather be an aunt to all 3 of them." He nodded, watching her intently as she stared at the crib with the triplets. Jonathan walked out of Nancy's room a while later, smiling sheepishly at the group that had gathered in the hallway. The mother has just woken up, and she'd like to see her babies. The others followed him eagerly as he pushed the cribs into the room. Ashley rushed over to Nancy, who was lying in bed looking exhausted. How was it? Was it as painful as they say it is? Nancy recalled being tortured by Stark on the boat ages ago, and she thought that giving birth wasn't half bad. It was no picnic, though, either. The difference was that, back then, the pain had been accompanied by despair. Good morning. I am Jacob Johnson. Katie climbed into bed and tried to fall asleep. She was still weak from giving birth, and her voice trembled slightly. I won't lie to you. It hurt like hell, but it was worth it. You'll survive. Don't worry. Ashley held her hand. I still have a few months left, but I'm already nervous. Maybe I should get a cesarean. Listen, if I manage to push 3 babies out of my uterus, you can certainly manage 1. It was painful, but everything went smoothly. Jonathan went up to the bed. Why don't you get some rest, sweetheart? You can talk later. You should spend some time with the babies. He turned to his sister, pretending to be annoyed. Stop pestering her with your problems and let her be. You can call her later if she's up to it. Ashley stuck her tongue out at him playfully. Are you her bodyguard? Jonathan took the little girl from her crib, and he gently placed her in Nancy's arms. Atham's jaw dropped. I see you're already a professional dad. I'd be so scared to carry something so tiny. Jonathan winked at him. You have 6 months to practice, man. Get a watermelon and carry it around. He then picked up one of the boys and handed him to his wife. And here's one of your boys. Atham laughed. How can you be sure it's a boy? They all look the same. They have IDs on their wrists, you moron. Wow. You really know nothing about this, do you? That's okay. He's only going to have 1 kid. He won't have to worry about telling triplets apart. Xavier teased. Atham pretended to be outraged. Are you suggesting I'm not man enough to make 3 babies? Ashley patted him on the shoulder. You're the manliest man in this room, my love. We're going to have a beautiful daughter who'll be the center of attention. All the boys will be after her. You'll see. After Jonathan finished placing his 3rd child in Nancy's arms, he turned around and looked at everyone with a proud expression. Thanks for coming and sharing the happiest day of our lives. He craned his neck and waved at Steve and Helga, who were standing by the door. Thanks for all your help, guys. Helga smiled shyly at him. You're welcome. I wouldn't have been able to do any of it without Steve. Steve, how many times have you hit a home run since you got married? Atham teased. Steve glared at him. Why don't you mind your own business? Helga nodded in agreement. He's right. We're not here to talk about us. Let's just focus on this happy occasion, shall we? We know what we're doing. No one was sure what she meant by that, so they turned their attention back to Nancy and the triplets. As soon as the babies had been born, Xavier had gone to fetch Esther. He knew he couldn't keep her away from her best friend on such a special day. Venus and Esther had each taken a baby from Nancy, and Harold and Xavier snapped pictures of them. Come a little closer, Esther told her husband. Can you see the baby's face? Xavier pointed his phone lens at her. Okay, turn her sideways a bit. That's it. She's so adorable. Doesn't she look like a princess? I want our next child to be a girl. Just then, the baby started crying. Esther frowned. Oh no, I think we've upset her. Maybe she's just tired. Jonathan went up to her and gently took the baby away. He cooed softly and rocked his daughter back and forth. She opened her mouth wide. He looked over at Nancy. Do you think she's hungry? She nodded. I think I need to breastfeed her. The boys must be hungry by now, too. Jonathan gestured to the friends and relatives to leave so they could have some privacy. Only he and the nurse remained. Nancy was anxious to see whether she had enough milk to feed all 3 of her babies. She sat up, cradled her firstborn in her arms, and placed his mouth next to her nipple. He immediately started sucking on it. Thank goodness, He's a smart little guy, isn't he? Do you think you'll have enough? Jonathan asked. I hope so. Do you remember the names we talked about? The ones that Harold suggested? She smiled. How could I forget? Tristan is our eldest son, Callum for our second boy, and Rebecca for our daughter. She watched as Tristan enjoyed his first big meal in the outside world. As soon as he had finished eating, Callum woke up and started crying. Nancy looked helplessly at her husband. This is going to be a nightmare. I can't feed all of them at once. I guess I won't be getting any sleep for a while. Jonathan laughed. But maybe you could master the skill of feeding 2 at a time. He looked lovingly at Rebecca, who was lying in his arms, patiently waiting for her turn to eat. After breastfeeding Callum, Nancy carefully put him back in his crib and held her arms out for Rebecca. She looked worried. I just hope I have enough breast milk for at least a year. What if I run out? Never thought of that. Maybe having triplets wasn't such a good idea. Jonathan snickered. As if we had a choice. Relax. If you don't have enough milk, we can feed them formula. He leaned over the crib and smiled at his sons. He straightened up a moment later, however. Nancy, what was that smell? She burst into laughter. I think your son just took a poop in his diaper. Jonathan waved his hand in front of his face. I can't believe how bad it smells. I think I'm going to gag. Nancy smiled. Come on, it's not that bad. We've taken care of babies before. Why don't you ask your sister to help? She's just outside. He nodded, went out, and returned with Sophia a moment later. They carried Tristan to the changing table, and then they carefully removed his blanket and his diaper. Jonathan took a step back. I don't think I can stomach this. Sophia laughed. You're a bigger baby than your son. Throw the diaper away and help me wash him. Jonathan got rid of the dirty diaper, and then he helped Sophia carry Tristan to the small plastic bathtub. He held his son as Sophia washed him, marveling at how small and fragile he was. He was barely the length of his hand to his elbow and was as light as a feather. Though he had read several books about babies during Nancy's pregnancy, he realized he still had to get used to handling infants, and he was grateful for his aunt's help. Nancy was feeding Rebecca, and her eyes lit up as she watched her husband and Sophia bathe Tristan. She recalled the first time she had laid eyes on Jonathan after she had reincarnated in Maria's body. He had seemed so cold and aloof, and his eyes had been full of resentment. She had never imagined him as someone she could become close to. She had preferred to make her arrangement with Steve, since Jonathan had given her the impression that he was dangerous and unreliable. Everyone in New York and Cuba had thought that of him. He had been ruthless, cruel, and stubborn, instilling fear in anyone who crossed his path. At that moment, as she watched Jonathan leaning over his firstborn and gently washing him as if his life depended on it, she marveled at how much he had changed. She felt warm and tingly all over, and her heart filled with love. Her husband had turned out to be the gentlest man alive. After Jonathan and Sophia finished changing his diaper, Tristan was hungry again, so he started crying. His father tried to soothe him, but he wouldn't have it. His wailing became louder, and he kicked his feet in frustration. Nancy looked down at Rebecca, who was still sucking away at her nipple. I guess Tristan will have to wait. His sister's not finished yet. They may not have enough breast milk left. She stared helplessly at Jonathan. Why don't we ask the nurse for some formula? Sophia suggested. Jonathan nodded. That's probably the best solution. They found the nurse, and they tried feeding Tristan with a bottle. After fussing for a while, he finally accepted it. Once he finished, he started crying again. The others, who were still in the waiting area outside the room, heard everything. Latham laughed and looked at Xavier and Esther. I bet you two can't wait for your babies to be born. How are you going to handle all that crying? He was trying to get back at them for suggesting he wasn't enough of a man earlier. Xavier shrugged indifferently. I'm sure we'll be just fine. Esther's really excited to have twins, and I'll support her no matter how many children she decides to have. Good luck with that. They continued to make fun of one another and joked about raising kids. Inside the room, Nancy had finished feeding Rebecca, and her breast milk was all gone. She looked at Tristan, who was sleeping soundly in his crib. "I'm sorry you had to have formula. I'll feed you again a bit later." Once all the triplets were full, Jonathan opened the door and called everyone in. Henry was eager to hold one of the babies, so he rushed over to Nancy, who was cradling Rebecca. "Can I pick her up? Just show me how to do it. I don't want to risk dropping her." Jonathan went over to help, and he gently placed his daughter in Henry's arms. The latter smiled down at his niece, and then he asked Venus to take a picture. She took out her phone and snapped a few photos as Henry tenderly kissed Rebecca's forehead. Jonathan smiled. "Just be careful. Don't kiss her too much. I don't want her getting germs." Henry looked back at her in mock astonishment. "Will you just look at that overbearing father? Come on, she deserves some love from her uncle too." Venus took Rebecca from him a moment later. She cradled the infant in her arms, and her eyes filled with tears when she remembered how she had lost her own baby. She desperately wanted another one. She told herself that at least she didn't have to worry about being poor again. The pain she had suffered years ago had subsided, so she could finally move on with her life. Nancy had told her that she could visit them any time and be part of the kids' lives. She would always be their aunt. Hannah stood by the crib, watching Tristan and Callum sleep. She desperately wanted to pick one of them up, but she didn't dare disturb them. Brock was bolder. "Maria, can I hold one of them?" Nancy nodded. "Of course, just be careful. Hannah, why don't you hold the other? Jonathan and Sophia can help you." Ashley quickly took out her phone and pointed its camera lens at them. "Okay, guys, say cheese." Hannah and Brock stood side by side, each holding one of the baby boys, and they smiled at the camera. Ashley took a dozen pictures and then showed them to the couple. "You look so happy. I can't wait for you guys to have kids." Brock was grinning from ear to ear. Hannah looked down at Callum's sweet face, and she felt a surge of love for him. Ashley wanted to take more pictures, but Hannah couldn't take her eyes off the newborn, so she gave up and uploaded the photos she had already taken to the group chat. Hannah caressed the baby's forehead and cheeks. She had never touched anything so soft and tender. After a while, she put Callum back in his crib, and she reached out for his tiny fist. He wrapped his little hand around her index finger, and she laughed. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so tiny and fragile. She suddenly remembered the baby she had lost the previous year. Had they survived, they'd be crawling or walking by now, she thought. She swallowed the lump in her throat, afraid to burst into tears in front of everyone. She quickly composed herself, gently removed her finger from Callum's grip, and then ran into the bathroom before anyone noticed something was wrong. Brock had been observing Hannah the whole time. When he saw her rush into the bathroom, he immediately knew she was upset. He quickly put Tristan into his crib, walked over to the bathroom, and tapped lightly on the door. "Anne, are you okay?" She leaned against the door without moving or saying anything. He knocked again. "Anne, come on, let me in." She took a deep breath to calm herself, but it was no use. She burst into tears and squatted on the floor, burying her head in her hands. Brock realized she hadn't locked the door, so he gently pushed it open and squeezed through. He then locked the door and knelt beside her. He looked at the tears streaming down her face, and an incredible feeling of sympathy and regret washed over him. He remembered the day she had fallen down the stairs and suffered the miscarriage. If only I hadn't been so jealous of Jonathan, he thought. If only I hadn't threatened her and had been more understanding, none of this would have happened. We'd be parents by now. It pained him to think of how cruel he had been to her the day after her miscarriage, when he had left her stranded outside in the freezing cold, without her phone and her house keys. They had been trying to conceive since they had gotten back together, but without success. He knew how awful she felt, watching everyone else around them get pregnant. He wrapped his arms around her and hugged her tightly. Anne, it's okay. Don't let it get to you. You're only in your mid-20s. You have all the time in the world. I promise we're going to have a baby sooner or later. She listened to his comforting words, but she found it hard to let go of her pain. She lay her head on his chest, crying even harder. He kissed the top of her head. Look at modern technology. It's evolved by leaps and bounds in the past years. Things we couldn't even fathom a decade ago have become a reality. The same goes for the medical profession. Even if we can't have kids now, maybe in 5 years, there'll be a breakthrough that'll make it possible. And with Helga's help, you can even become pregnant in the next year. She nodded and lifted her head. You're right. Technology makes so many things possible. Of course it does. Look at the robots the Davis Group developed. They're already intelligent, but in 5 years, they'll be capable of doing things beyond our wildest imagination. Hannah thought about what he said, wishing it was true and wondering whether modern medicine could help save her from despair. She took out a tissue and wiped her tear-stained face. Brock leaned over and kissed her on the lips, pressing her against the door and running his fingers through her hair. Outside the bathroom, everyone was still busy celebrating the birth of the triplets. When Callum pooped in his diaper while Etham was holding him, Harold joked that in Cuba, it was considered to be a sign of good things to come. At one point, Sophia tried to go into the bathroom, but she discovered that it was locked. Is someone in there? I just want to get some water. Hannah turned red with embarrassment, and she looked at Brock with a panicked expression. They were lying half naked on the floor. He was calm and composed, though. He smiled at her as he pulled up his trousers, and then he opened the door a crack and poked his head out. Just give us a second, Sophia. Hannah's washing her hands. She looked at him in bewilderment, wondering what the two of them were doing in there together. She held up an empty plastic cup. I just wanted to get a glass of water. He took the cup from her. Oh, okay. In that case, I'll get some for you. He closed the door, and a moment later, Hannah walked out, smiling feebly at Sophia and pretending that nothing had happened. She was utterly humiliated, and she hoped Sophia wouldn't say anything to Jonathan. After filling the cup of water, Brock gave it to Sophia, and they stood chatting by the door. Hannah watched him with surprise. He wasn't usually so talkative, but he seemed extremely animated and happy that day. He even offered to help Sophia bathe Callum and change his diaper. She laughed when she saw him gently washing the infant's buttocks, and she felt more relaxed all of a sudden. The party ended when Rebecca dirtied her diaper and started crying hysterically. Jonathan joked that she was too embarrassed to show her tushy, so he kindly asked everyone to leave the room. Only he and Sophia remained. Nancy was exhausted, as were Ashley and Esther, so the group finally left the hospital late that afternoon. Jonathan sat by the edge of the bed, watching his wife and 3 babies sleeping peacefully. He was relieved it had been such a smooth birth and that Nancy had done so well. They were discharged from the hospital 2 days later. Jonathan, Venus, and Harold went to pick them up and take them home. The villa, which had been so quiet the past few days, welcomed 3 very loud and fussy new members. Jonathan and Nancy had already prepared the babies' rooms. They had decided that each child should have their own room, so as not to disturb each other. They soon discovered that this was wise. Whenever the infants were together and one cried, the other 2 followed suit, and it was next to impossible to calm them down. Nancy was exhausted for several days after returning from the hospital. She spent most of her time resting on the couch in the living room. She had never imagined that feeding 3 babies would be such a challenge. It was a round-the-clock endless project, and she barely got a few hours of sleep at night. Once she had finished feeding one child, the other 2 became hungry, and the cycle began all over again. Jonathan took a few weeks off work to help her, but he spent a couple of hours in his study each day to catch up on emails and go over paperwork. The exercise room in the basement was hastily converted into a space for urgent meetings, and Jack and a few senior executives showed up occasionally. Harold stayed inside the villa the whole time, refusing to leave Nancy despite her reassurances that she would survive without him for a few hours. He never picked up his phone when it rang, claiming there was nothing that couldn't wait until he returned to Cuba. Nancy looked forward to the little free time she had every day. She checked her social media handles for updates, played video games, and spoke to Esther on the phone, who was already in the middle of her third trimester. Her friend laughed when she told her she felt like a prisoner in her own home. A few weeks later, once they had gotten over the trauma of being new parents, Jonathan and Nancy decided to organize a big party at the villa to officially celebrate the birth of their triplets. Jonathan and Nancy invited all their friends, including some of his childhood buddies, to celebrate their newborns. The villa and the garden, which had been decorated with colorful balloons, streamers, and lights, were exceptionally welcoming and lively on the day of the big party. Esther and Xavier were the first to arrive, and they sat on the couch eating pastries. Esther had only 2 weeks left of her pregnancy, so she found it incredibly difficult to stand and move around. Xavier wanted them to stay at home, but she had insisted on going, arguing that she was feeling fine. Jacob had a break from school, so he immediately bought a plane ticket when Nancy invited him to the party, eager to meet his nephews and niece. His sister was surprised at how good he was with them. He coddled them and held them for hours, and they seemed to take an instant shine to him. Neither child cried in his presence, and they easily fell asleep in his arms. He had just rocked Rebecca to sleep when the other guests arrived, and he breathed a sigh of relief as he put her in the cradle. His phone rang just then, so he quickly left the room before she woke up. It was his new assistant that was helping him handle affairs at the Franklin Group. "Mr. Johnson, I sent the report you asked for to your email address. Also, I wanted to tell you that Mr. King heard you were in New York and he'd like to see you. He happens to be there at the moment." "Great. Thanks for letting me know. I'll take a look at the report as soon as I can. Can you ask Mr. King to meet me the day after tomorrow?" "Sure. I'll ask him to get in touch with you. Have a wonderful time in New York." Henry was standing by the door of Rebecca's room, listening to the conversation curiously. He was transferring back to the States to continue his studies, and he couldn't wait to get his diploma and start working. He looked at Jacob with admiration. "Dude, you're so amazing. You sounded so professional just now. I envy you for having a job." Jacob smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "I have to work to make some money, but I like my job. It makes me feel important." Henry had found out what had happened to Jacob because of Stark, and he felt bad for him. "I'm glad I found something that I love doing," Jacob continued. "Nancy was right. Business and marketing aren't for me, so there's no point in pursuing them. I'd only end up hating my job in the long run. That's why I've decided to design video games. After I graduate, I'm going to work at Brightstar." Henry nodded. "Yeah, I heard about that. That's great. Maybe you and I'll end up working together someday. I'm also interested in the gaming industry." They went downstairs to join the guests who had arrived. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining, and it was the perfect afternoon to host a garden party. Jonathan had put up a sun umbrella on the enormous patio, and he brought his 2 sons out to enjoy the fresh air. Henry pointed to the basketball court on the other side of the garden. "Jacob, how about a game?" Emma, Peter, Xavier, and Eduardo also wanted to join. Nancy saw that Jonathan was desperate to play too, so she encouraged him. "Go on. I know you haven't played for a while. Let's see you dribble that ball. I'll go get Rebecca, and we'll cheer you on." He kissed her on the lips. How can I refuse? He asked Sophia to watch the babies while he went inside to change into a pair of shorts and a t-shirt and put on some sneakers. Everyone gathered around the basketball court to watch the 2 teams play. It was obvious that Eduardo was the best player. He ran around the court, effortlessly dribbling the ball and skillfully avoiding his opponents. He was simply unstoppable. The other team was strong too, however, so it was a tight game. Nancy hugged Rebecca to her body as she shouted encouragingly to Jonathan. "Come on, hubby, you can do it! Let's see a slam dunk." She looked down at her daughter, who had just fallen asleep in her arms. "We're rooting for you, Daddy. Aren't we, sweetheart?" Jonathan snatched the ball away from Eduardo, aimed, and threw the ball through the hoop. Nancy clapped and cheered enthusiastically. Rebecca opened her eyes, and she seemed to smile ever so slightly. Her mother was stunned. "Jonathan, you'll never believe this. Becca just smiled at me. She's so adorable." Her husband blew her a kiss before turning his attention back to the game. The battle became even more intense. It was a hot afternoon, and everyone on the court was sweating profusely. Brock had just snatched the ball after a rebound, and he passed it to Eduardo, who threw a beautiful shot. Brock winked at Hannah, who was watching him. She was still upset about her condition, so she found it hard to talk to Nancy and Esther without breaking down. Although she put on a brave face and cheered for Brock's team, she felt dead inside. Brock didn't seem to notice, however, and her smile and her encouraging words motivated him to play even harder. He ran after Xavier, who was dribbling the ball toward the hoop. Esther was anxiously watching the game, forgetting her tiredness momentarily. She was keeping score, and she noted that Eduardo had the most field goals. Jonathan was in second place, and Xavier lagged behind the other 8 players. She put her hand on her stomach. "Come on, Xavier, make your babies proud. You need to up your game." Ashley laughed when she heard her, but her smile vanished when she looked at Lotham sitting next to her. She felt so sorry for him. A while ago, he could have easily joined the game. She remembered his mother showing her old photos of him playing basketball in high school. He had been so proud of himself, telling her that he had been one of the best players and that girls had lined up after the games to congratulate him and ask him out. She had felt jealous then, but at that moment, watching everyone enjoying themselves on the court, her heart ached for him. She could tell he was envious and discouraged, so she grabbed his hand and put her head on his shoulder. "It's okay, my love. Your ankle's going to heal soon, and they can all eat their hearts out. You'll teach your daughter how to play too, and I'll cheer you on." He kissed the top of her head. "I thought you wanted her to take ballet lessons from Sydney." "She can do both." He nodded. "We can also think about having a boy." She sat up and looked him in the eye, pretending to be upset. "Are you suggesting you don't think a girl can play basketball?" He laughed. "Of course not. She can do whatever she wants. I wouldn't mind if she learned martial arts, though. It'll come in handy for fending off all the men who are going to chase after her." "I suppose Norman would be the best person to teach her."